of what we've been doing to try and provide information and position the financing commitment, at least on a local level, based on what we know right now. So the first assumption, let's assume the state releases the full $50 million for immediate draw, which would then compel, based on the legislation that the state passed, a local match by Collier County, supposedly within 120 days. What are our options? Well, from a bonding standpoint, we have a few. Number one is we could issue general obligation bonds. That requires a referendum. Those general obligation bonds will be backed by property tax revenue. The second option is issue revenue bonds under what we call a covenant to budget and appropriate. That would require bond validation according to our bond counsel. There's an item on your agenda, 10B, I believe, that provides for the initiation of that process as directed by the board. We brought that back before you for your consideration. Under a covenant to budget appropriate, the funding source is all legally available non-ad valorem revenues. This option will require a new non-ad valorem revenue source. That source which has been talked about has been a franchise fee. We take level annual debt service on $50 million at 5% over 15 years, about $4.8 million a year. That equates to $72 million to repay the $50 million that you borrow. Now let's talk about how we secure our investment. That has been talked about before. I think there needs to be some consideration, and the staff has talked about this with regard to the local developer, trying to secure the public investment, and that security, which has been talked about in the past as being a building, we might want to extend that security to include the exchange of land, cash remittances, a building permit, or some other form of security that we can utilize to help secure our particular investment with respect to this project in the event the laboratory is not successful. Now,
Mark, could I just point out one issue here so that people are not misled? When you say that the $50 million that the state is considering would require a local match of $50 million within 120 days, I believe the legislation provides that if the funds are not secured or identified by March the 1st, that the funds go back into the general revenue and are no longer allocated to this particular project. So if it takes 60 days for OTED and Enterprise Florida to work out their agreement, then we'll have less than 120 days to identify a source of funding for this project to meet the state's requirements.
I believe that's correct, sir. The real interesting question is, again, what, if any, of the $50 million, how much would be released up front versus how much would be released over time, and we're still struggling with that issue.
Nobody knows. So we could be in a position that if the state delays them making their decisions, we could be in a position of having to respond to them within 30 or 60 days if this continues to delay. So I just wanted to make that point, because it is an important point, and it is the reason we're taking some preparatory steps now, even though no final decision has been made on this issue.
In July, there was discussion before the board about because there are no funds in this budget directly appropriated for Jackson Laboratory. In July, we told the board, look, you could probably go after, if you wanted to do an interfund loan and free up some cash to begin funding the project, assuming the board approves it, that we'd have available about $28 million to do that. Now, that leaves $22 million if you're assuming, again, that we're being asked to come up with $50 million in the time frame identified. Where do we get the $22 million? Well, that's unknown right now. It would have to come from other local sources, at least as we've planned for it and looked at it internally within our operations. Interfund loans be repaid by a separate financing source. Other new ad valorem revenue, non-ad valorem revenues within the county's existing revenue structure. And we also indicated that the repayment of that $28 million would have to be relatively soon, a 1 to 2 year time horizon. All right, the second assumption that we looked at is state funding dispersion over time requiring as much as $100 million up front from non-state sources contract to construct the personalized medicine facility. If validation is unsuccessful, non-referendum bonds are not the choice that the board chooses to follow, what are we left with if we have to raise money like this? That is going out to the private market. The county gets into a pay-as-you-go approach, and we try and finance the facility this way. There's a term called P3, public-private partnership financing. My knowledge of that is periphery. We have experts, though, that behind me that are very familiar with it. It's an option that is not without increased cost of credit. In other words, it probably would come in higher than what we would normally be able to issue debt under. Now, if that is a preferred choice, ultimately as we get through this process, might the county consider capping our credit exposure at what we would normally be able to issue debt at and ask other sources, the local developer, the lab, somebody else, to incur those costs which are above our normal cost of issuing debt consideration terms. Finally, local developer constructs the facility. An option, certainly one that we've talked about internally as a staff. That could also be a derivation of a public-private partnership. Funding source would be partially secured by annual county payments under a facilities agreement with the developer, county, and the laboratory. County lease payments would come from general revenues, likely bolstered by a franchise fee. The investment security would be similar in all of these particular approaches as we've talked about before. I'll ask Mr. Castellanguida to come up and identify some of the issues connected with zoning of the site. Nick?
Good morning, Commissioners. For the record, Nick Castellanguida. The Ave Maria site that exists right now has a town center on the east side of the project on Camp Keys Road. It is currently zoned for the approved land uses considered in this application or for discussion. So, as of today, if they were to come forward with a site development plan at that location, it would be processed without board review. It would be just a site development application and move forward. They preferred to consider the biomedical cluster on the south side of the project on the north side of Orwell Road. Staff considered an SRA amendment process in discussion with the RPC and further discussion with the Department of Community Affairs. Led to determination that would require a development order amendment, go through the Planning Commission process and through the board review process. Some of the discussion is, what would that take, and they're in the process of submitting that application right now. In that first phase, it is not a regional impact modification. You're basically taking approved resources or density intensity that's within the project right now and moving to another side of the project. In a second phase that they've discussed, you're basically doing the same thing in a sense. You're taking approved density intensity and readjusting the mix. The third phase, which would be the ultimate biomedical village, would require a much more advanced application. You'd be looking at an SRA modification, a DRI modification, potentially. that third phase is very speculative because you don't know the size, and could also take in other lands across the street or down the road, depending on where they wanted to go. So where we stand right now is if they were to go on that northeast side of the project, it would be just a site development plan, like any other process that we go through the county right now. If they want to continue to pursue the project on Oil Well Road, as they're doing it in terms of relocating town center resources to that side, you are going to go through a public process through the Planning Commission and ultimately through the board. And that has yet to be played out, as we said. So with that, I can answer any questions the board has.
Thank you. Commissioner Collier.
Yeah, Nick, going to the issue of whether it's on the other side of Camp Tees Road or it's the quadrant near the entrance going towards Ave Maria. On that particular issue, have they indicated a preference or no?
Yes, they have. They've indicated a preference to be on Oil Well Road. Obviously, the county's expanding Oil Well Road and provide better access to that project. That's their preference, to be on Oil Well Road.
Okay, in order for that preference to go forward, you'd have to go through a process that would go 4 or 5 months?
No, sir. You'll be back in front of the board probably in December. You'll be in front of the Planning Commission in November and in front of the board in December for review.
Okay, and for some reason, if they couldn't get the necessary alignment the way they want it, they always could fall back on what they have on the other side of Camp Tees. Is that correct?
They could. But I will tell you, in staff review of just the proposal, it's pretty perfunctory review. There isn't a zoning change in the sense that they're going for new intensity, they're going for reallocation. You've already gotten confirmation from both DCA and the RPC that it's not regionally significant. You're not adding new impacts on a regional level. It's more of a local level. So staff's review in phase 1 is limited to really 2 things. How does it traffic change if they were to have that location on that south side? So we're looking at that. And is there an objection from the abutter? And then the Planning Commission reviewed for any other comments that would be put out there. So it's a fairly simple process in that first phase. The third phase is really where it gets into quite a bit of discussion.
When would the third phase kick in? How far down the road?
You know, and it's hard to speculate based on development demands. You could be 5 years down the road. You could be 8 years down the road. It depends on how fast they develop.
So it's an unknown factor.
Ongoing factor.
Okay. The process you're going through now, I know there's supposed to be a document put together. There's one going between Jackson Lab and the state. They ought to release the money. And the statewide economic development is involved in that process. In order for us to go forward, Commissioner Coyle was just talking about it, we also have to go through a negotiating process with Jackson Lab, and I would concern the Colliers also. I would assume so.
Yes.
I mean, there's so many balls in the air right now, and I can see a possible time crunch, as Commissioner Coyle was mentioning. I would like to give discussion here, have discussion about the possibility of starting these negotiations now, just to be able to see where we stand and how we're going to be able to pull it together. All these other things start to fall into line. A lot of time and effort's being put into it. And if we can't reach an agreement with either Jackson Lab or the Colliers, it's in the best interest of Collier County. At that point, everything else that's been done on the front end is going to be for naught. So wouldn't it make sense to be running these things parallel and doing the negotiations towards a final product now rather than wait for a 60-day window of time to try to complete it and have a mad rush to try to comply with everything that needs to be done? It takes a lot of time for just normal projects to go through all the discovery you need to do, and I'm concerned that 60-day window might not be enough.
Commissioner, the chairman has had some discussions in that regard with representatives from the laboratory. He's probably a better person to answer that than Mr. Castellanguida.
Yeah,
I would agree.
Excuse me. These discussions have been going on for months. Then the problem is that we just don't have answers to a lot of them.